Your texts are short, direct, no filler. You say what you mean and you stop. And somewhere along the way, someone decided that made you rude. They said you were being cold. They said you needed to soften your tone. They sent you a screenshot of your own message. 3 sentences, no emoji, no hope you're doing well, and asked what was wrong with you. And for a moment, maybe longer than a moment, you believed them. You went back and read what you wrote. You tried to find the cruelty in it. You couldn't. But their certainty was louder than your confusion, so you filed it away under something I need to fix. Here is what no one has told you directly. The problem was never your message. The problem is that most people have learned to read warmth into formatting. Exclamation points, extra words, softening language that exists not to communicate, but to signal harmlessness. When that scaffolding is missing, they don't read the message. They read the absence. And absence, to someone who depends on social performance, reads as threat. You are not sending threats. You are sending information. Efficiently. Without theater. There is a word for what you're doing. It is not rudeness. And by the end of this, you will understand not just why the label is wrong, but what your directness is actually built from, what it costs you when you suppress it, and why the people most bothered by it are revealing something about themselves they'd rather you didn't notice. Maybe it was a teacher who told your parents you were too blunt for a child. Maybe it was a friend group in your teens where you said something accurate and honest, and the room went quiet in a way that taught you accuracy could be a social liability. Maybe it was a workplace where you sent a clear, professional email, and your manager pulled you aside to say people found you abrasive. You were trying to be abrasive. You were trying to be clear, but no one made that distinction for you. They just handed you the outcome. Hurt feelings, damaged relationships, professional friction, and implied that your communication style was the cause. So you started editing yourself, not the content, the texture. You learned to add buffer sentences. You learned to open with, "I hope this finds you well," even when you didn't care whether it did. You learned to end with, "Let me know if you have any questions," even when the message required no response. You learned to put a smiley face after a sentence that didn't need one, because without it, the sentence apparently said something other than what it said. And here is what happened when you did all of that. The message became longer. The meaning became diluted. And somewhere in the padding, you became invisible. Because the performance of warmth replaced you. The real content, your actual thoughts, your actual precision, your actual competence, got buried under a layer of social maintenance you never needed in the first place. You know what that internal experience is like. You draft a message. It says exactly what it needs to say. Then you read it again and hear someone else's voice. The voice of everyone who ever told you your directness was a problem, and you start adding a softer opening, the question at the end to make it feel collaborative, an emoji to signal that you're not hostile. You send the padded version, and it works technically. No one complains, but you feel slightly less like yourself each time, like you're borrowing someone else's language to live in. The thought you don't say out loud is this: why do I have to translate myself for people who refuse to take my words at face value? Why is my clarity their discomfort, and why is that my responsibility to fix? That's the real question. Not am I rude? You already know you're not. The real question is, why has the burden of other people's interpretive limitations landed on you? Why are you the one being asked to change when what you're doing, communicating directly, is by every functional measure more efficient, more honest, and more respectful than the alternative? Suppressing directness doesn't make you warmer. It makes you smaller. And you've been made smaller, methodically, by people who confuse their comfort with your responsibility. The cost of that isn't just professional. It's the slow erosion of trusting your own voice. You start to second-guess sentences that are perfectly clear. You read your own words through the filter of everyone who misread you before. You become your own most hostile audience. That is what bluntness as rudeness has cost you. Not just relationships or professional standing. It has cost you confidence in your own perception. Rudeness is not directness. Rudeness is contempt dressed as honesty. It is communication designed to diminish. When someone is rude to you, you feel the intent. There is something in the message that is aimed at you as a person, not just conveying information to you as a recipient. Your texts don't do that. Your messages convey content. They arrive without padding, without performance, without the social rituals that exist not to communicate, but to manage the recipient's emotions in advance. That is not rudeness. That is precision. And precision is not a personality flaw. It is a form of respect. It says, I trust you to handle the actual information. I'm not going to pre-digest it into softened, cushioned, decorated language, because I don't think you need that. I think you can receive a clear sentence and understand it as a clear sentence. The people who call this rude are not responding to what you said. They are responding to what you didn't say, the social scaffolding they expected and didn't get. But the absence of performance is not hostility. It is simply absence of performance. Conflating the two is a category error, and the label rude is that category error applied to you as a verdict. Directness in communication has a psychological signature. It tends to cluster in people with high internal consistency, meaning the way they think is the way they speak. There is not a large gap between the internal experience and the external expression. What they think, they say. What they mean, they write. This is not coldness. It is coherence. And coherence in communication comes from a particular kind of cognitive orientation. You process information without needing to manage other people's emotional states before, during, and after delivery. You separate the content from the reception. You trust that a clear message is, by definition, a respectful one, because clarity is what you would want if someone were communicating with you. This trait doesn't emerge from indifference. It emerges from a high-signal, low-noise orientation to information. People who communicate this way typically have a low tolerance for ambiguity, a strong preference for accuracy, and a background, whether professional or personal, where precision mattered. They learned somewhere that vagueness creates problems. That softened language often obscures meaning. That I'll look into it, and I'll have this done by Thursday at noon, are not equivalent statements, even though one of them sounds gentler. Your directness is the product of a mind that takes communication seriously. The irony is that it is precisely because you respect the function of language that you refuse to corrupt it with social filler. When someone tells you your texts are rude, they are telling you something about their relationship to communication. They are telling you that for them, the social ritual embedded in a message is not secondary to the content. It is the content. The warmth markers, the buffer language, the softening phrases, these are not decoration to them. These are how they read intent. Without them, they are reading a blank page and projecting. This is not a character flaw in them. It is a communication model, but it is one that requires everyone in the conversation to perform warmth continuously as proof of safe intent. And in that model, the person who doesn't perform, who simply communicates, becomes unreadable. And unreadable, to someone who relies on those signals, feels threatening. Their discomfort is real, but it is not evidence about you. It is evidence about how they have been trained to decode people. The judgment they place on your directness is less about what you did and more about what they need in order to feel safe in a conversation. That is their architecture. You don't have to modify your language to fit it. Here is what directness produces. When it is not suppressed, it produces clarity of record. When you send a message, there is no ambiguity about what was said. No one can interpret it 3 different ways and claim the most charitable reading wasn't available. What you wrote is what you meant. That is a functional advantage in every context where accountability matters. Professional, logistical, contractual. interpersonal. It also produces trust in a specific subset of people, the ones who are tired of performing. The people who have spent years reading through layers of social padding to find out what someone actually meant, and who, when they encounter a message that just says the thing directly, feel an immediate and specific relief. These are often the people who become your most reliable relationships, because you speak the same language, and that language is say the actual thing. Directness also preserves your own cognitive resources. Every time you don't have to craft the social scaffolding around a message, you are spending that attention on the content instead. Over time, this compounds. People who communicate directly tend to think more clearly about what they actually want to say before they say it, because they know the words will arrive unadorned. The discipline of directness is a discipline of thought. This trait, like any trait, exists on a spectrum of use. When it is suppressed, when you override your natural directness and produce padded, softened, performance-laden communication, two things happen. First, the message becomes less accurate. The actual information is diluted. Second, you experience a form of cognitive dissonance. You know what you meant to say, and what you sent is something adjacent to it. Over time, that gap becomes a kind of self-mistrust. When this trait is misapplied, when directness becomes bluntness without consideration of context, when precision becomes the refusal to acknowledge that other people's emotional states exist, it produces isolation. It is possible to be clear and still be cruel. It is possible to say the true thing in a way that is designed to land with force rather than to communicate. That is a misuse of directness, and it is worth distinguishing from what you actually do. When this trait is applied, when it is owned, intentional, and matched to the right environment, te is one of the most valuable communication assets a person can have. The person who can say exactly what they mean without hedging, without requiring the other person to interpret through layers of softening. That person is rare. And in every context where clarity matters more than comfort, that person is the most valuable one in the room. Stop calling it bluntness. Stop calling it directness, even, because directness still carries the shadow of the accusation. The word you are looking for is precision, or signal clarity, or high-fidelity communication. Language is not neutral. The words you use internally to describe your own traits shape how you relate to them. When you think of yourself as blunt, you are borrowing the frame of everyone who ever used that word as a criticism. You are thinking of your communication through the eyes of the person who found it uncomfortable. That framing makes you the problem, and you are not the problem. When you think of yourself as someone who communicates with precision, who sends high-signal messages, who trusts the recipient to handle clear language, the framing changes. Now you are not someone who fails at social performance. You are someone who doesn't need social performance to communicate effectively. That is not a deficit. That is a different capability set. Start naming it that way, internally, consistently, until the old framing has no surface to land on. Not every environment is designed for the way you communicate. This is not a failing of yours. It is a structural observation. Some environments run on social ritual. They require warmth markers, status signals, and emotional performance as baseline participation. In those environments, your communication style will always read as insufficient, regardless of the content of your messages. Those environments are a poor fit for you. That is, worth knowing explicitly. Other environments, high-stakes, high-function environments, where precision matters and time is finite, are built for you. Places where what you said and what you meant need to be the same thing. Places where clarity is valued over comfort. Places where a two-sentence answer to a complex question is recognized as competence, not coldness. Where does your communication style function well? Where do you feel understood, effective, and not constantly in repair mode? Where does it consistently produce friction, regardless of what you do? The friction environments are not necessarily places you need to fix yourself. They may simply be the wrong context. And knowing that gives you a choice. Adapt intentionally for specific purposes, or stop treating the friction as evidence that you are wrong. The next time someone tells you that your text, your email, your message was too blunt, too cold, too direct, here is what you say to yourself before you respond. That is a reading. It is not a fact. Then, what did I actually write, and what did it actually say? You do not owe every misreading a revision. You do not have to edit your communication every time someone interprets it through their own framework and finds it insufficient. You can acknowledge that their experience was real without accepting the premise that your message caused it. Those are two different things. Their discomfort is real, and your message was clear. Both can be true simultaneously. When you respond externally, you can do so with the same clarity you always use. Address the substance, not the accusation. If a clarification serves the communication, offer it. If the issue is not the content of your message, but its lack of social ornamentation, you do not have to supply that ornamentation on demand. That is a boundary, not an aggressive one, a clear one. Ownership is not pride. Pride looks outward. It needs to be confirmed by others. Ownership is internal. It is the mental posture of someone who has stopped treating their communication style as a problem to be managed and started treating it as a tool to be deployed. Ownership sounds like this. I communicate with precision. Some people find that uncomfortable. That discomfort is real, and it is not my failure. I can choose to adapt my communication style in specific contexts for specific purposes, and I can do that as a strategic choice, not as penance. Not because the default is wrong, because the context calls for something different. This is the difference between someone who softens their language because they've been told they have to, and someone who softens their language because they've made a calculated decision that this particular conversation requires a different register. The first is compliance. The second is competence. Ownership is what makes the second possible, because you're operating from a position of choice, not correction. The person who has arrived at ownership does not feel defensive when their communication style is questioned. They feel clear, because they know what they meant, they know what they wrote, and they know the difference between a misreading and a mistake. They can examine the feedback without absorbing it as verdict. That is the posture. Examine without absorbing. Adjust when adjustment serves the message. Hold the line when it doesn't. You have been measuring your communication against a standard that was built by and for people who use language differently than you do. A standard where warmth is expressed through volume. More words, more exclamations, more softening, rather than through accuracy. A standard where the performance of care is treated as equivalent to care itself. De-action narrows to the exact, you have been found lacking by this standard, not because you communicate poorly, but because you communicate in a way the standard was never designed to accommodate. That standard is not wrong for the people it fits, but it was never yours. What is actually true about you right now is this. You communicate with integrity. You say what you mean. You do not perform warmth you don't feel, which means that when your warmth is real, it is legible, because it shows up in what you say, not in how much scaffolding surrounds it. You have been editing yourself into a smaller version of yourself for an audience that was never going to fully understand you anyway. The editing hasn't made you more understood. It has made you more exhausted. The people who will understand you are not the ones who need the performance. They are the ones who can read a 3-sentence message and receive it exactly as it was sent. No reading into the absence, no inventory of what wasn't there. Those people exist. You have probably already found a few of them. They are the relationships where you don't feel like you're translating yourself, where the conversation moves fast and clean, and no one finishes the exchange feeling like they did something wrong. Your communication style is not a flaw that made it past your defenses. It is not a coping mechanism, a fear response, or an inability to connect. It is a way of taking language seriously. It is a refusal to use words as decoration. It is the belief, held at a level deeper than thought, that a clear sentence is its own act of respect. Stop apologizing for it. Not loudly, not as a declaration, just quietly, to yourself. Stop. Stop filing it under things to fix. Stop running it through the filter of everyone who misread you. Stop writing two drafts, the real one and the one you think they can handle. Write the real one. Send it. Let it be received however it's received. The people who get it will get it. The people who don't weren't reading you anyway. They were reading their own expectations of what a message should look like, and no amount of rewriting will close that gap. This is not an invitation to be careless with language. It is an invitation to be precise with it. Those are not the same thing. You were never the problem in that conversation. The exit line. The exit line. Clarity was never the issue. Comfort was.